Thanks, Holly. Thanks for that. And a great segue to this topic, addressing regulatory mismatches in open data frameworks. Um, I often look back at conversations with central bankers and regulators about open data standards and the question of whether they are converging, consolidating, or fragmenting. And often the conversation starts at one end and ends up at the fragmentation end. And this panel is trying to peel the onion a bit on this truth that we are increasingly seeing, that when it comes to real world implementation of open data frameworks, technical standardization like ISO 222, for example, is just not enough. It's not the lack of APIs, but rather the lack of the regulatory alignment to begin with, a lack of trust and trust anchors underlying, and challenges with essentially underlying infrastructure and the overall drive itself for reaching alignment across jurisdictions. So fundamental challenges of fragmentation in the regulatory space and the infrastructure space. So we'll review this through some thought leadership and some market insights, as well as some real life use cases. I have with me today a really good panel of experts. One is Douglas Arner from Silence Laboratories, and we have Maxim Nesheret from CMA. So let me open up the conversation first with Douglas. You spent time looking at regulations across the world and reviewing and analyzing, and as well as you published some thought leadership on this space. I would love to hear your views on what you see globally and in Asia Pacific as well, in terms of the fragmentation we're speaking about, in terms of regulatory and infrastructure approaches, perhaps. It'll be great to hear more about real life implementations as well, and how they're getting increasingly complicated by aspects like data protection, cybersecurity, and other factors. And also at the same time, maybe a comment also on trust anchors and their relevance to this entire dialogue. Douglas, over to you.
Thanks, Rahul. And I'd like to say also thanks to ABAC, APDFF, and EPAA for the invitation and the coordination. And I should say, for all my friends on the call, I'm still very much at the University of Hong Kong. I think it's a typo on the Solidus Labs. I'm not even sure what that is. As Rahul mentioned, my team has just finished a major study looking at, and the title I just shared it in the chat, called Building Open Finance, from Policy to Infrastructure. And I think in many ways, the title of that paper sums up many of the issues and the challenges that we're looking at. And I want to say first that I'm really coming at this from the direction of finance. I basically focus on finance, financial sector development, financial inclusion issues, and the role of technology. So a lot of my work focuses on the intersection between finance, data, and technology. And so I'm going to be framing this coming from the finance angle, but I really want to take out, I think, two different pieces from the paper. And then I think a little bit later in the second part, we'll talk about some of the structural approaches that we're actually seeing and some of the lessons that we can learn from Nexus, from Aperta, from a range of other sorts of ongoing projects. So the first of these is really this idea of evolution. And what I often find when one is talking about open banking, open finance, open data, that people are actually coming from very different perspectives. And it often means that what I may be talking about actually is completely different from the direction that someone else is coming from. And I think we see this particularly from the standpoint of those three frames: open banking, open finance, open data. Now, technically, open banking is about methods, mechanisms, requirements for sharing information between banks. And that's quite important because when we think about fragmentation, open banking is generally driven by central banks and banking regulators. They often don't have scope of authority of finance outside of their area, nor do they have any scope of authority on data outside of the financial sector. So if you're talking about a jurisdiction where you have a responsible party that is coming from an open banking perspective, and they're trying to have a conversation with someone who's talking about open data, very frequently, fundamentally, they're not talking about the same thing. And this becomes particularly important when we're talking about data and data in finance. Finance is a highly regulated industry, and this means that it comes with its own regulatory frameworks, many of which govern data. Data today now has an increasingly complicated regulatory framework of its own. And if one is talking about data outside of finance, one can ignore all of the financial regulations. But if one is dealing with data in finance, one has to deal with both the financial regulatory perspective as well as the data regulatory perspective. So I think this first aspect of fragmentation is actually about differences in approach. Similarly, this development of the idea of open banking or open finance or open data has come from a variety of different sources. From one direction, it's come from what has almost been a social movement, this idea of the ability to control one's own data. From another, if we think about the EU experience, it actually came from mechanisms to reduce banks' dominance of particularly the payment system to enable new forms of competition. Increasingly today, we're thinking about data frameworks for credit, or we're thinking about data frameworks from the standpoint of empowering AI, a very broad range of different approaches. So that's one. Second idea is traditionally in open banking or open finance, we characterize approaches as industry-led, regulatory-led, or mandatory. And I think what we're seeing as a general trend is more and more jurisdictions moving towards mandatory approaches, because in many cases, industry-led hasn't worked. Regulator-led can work in some narrow contexts, but we're typically finding that if one wants to have significant movement towards free transferability of data, it requires a mandatory approach. But as I think was highlighted several times, both in the introductory remarks from Raul, but also already in the discussion, just having that set of standards or even a mandatory requirement actually isn't enough. And so now we're seeing, as was just talked about in the Brazilian context, an increasing range of jurisdictions which are building specific infrastructures to enable data sharing within their jurisdictions. And in many cases, those are working best in jurisdictions which have what I frame as first generation DPI, digital public infrastructure systems, which are typically ID account frameworks and fast payment systems. And if you're a jurisdiction like Brazil or India that has a first generation DPI framework, this provides a basis for infrastructure for a system to enable use of data. Now, that's essentially just the domestic context. And so once we try to add in the cross-border aspect, trying to join up the dots between what is already a very disparate set of approaches is a challenge. But I think the lesson to come out of domestic trends so far is there is this movement towards broader data strategies. Second, there's a move towards more mandatory approaches, whether that is just for banking, for finance across the financial sector, or for a number of jurisdictions like UAE or Australia that are trying to go beyond banking or finance. And finally, this trend domestically, which I think is central to the cross-border discussion of trying to build infrastructure, which then actually enables use and sharing of data on a cross-border basis.
Thanks, Douglas. And looking at both domestic and cross-border, one of the areas which has been tremendously fragmented and essentially getting more and more complex every day with the number of form factors, the number of stakeholders involved, is payments. And Douglas, you refer to that as well as part of your comments. I would like to turn to Maxim now. And given, Maxim, that CMA has been one of the global drivers of evolution of the payment systems or national infrastructures driving payments globally, um, how do you view this challenge of regulatory disparity, standards, fragmentation, when you think about it from a cross-border and a domestic perspective? Great to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, thank you, Rahul. Thank you for having me here. Yeah, as you mentioned, so that's we dealing to building those infrastructure. Yeah, I'm doing that for last 20 years. What I see during last 10, 15 years, most of those operators of national infrastructure, they more concentrated on the, let's call it, technical aspects of transaction processing. Right? It should be fast, secure. Everybody should be integrated. So interoperability on technical level. Most of operator with whom I work actually don't have this open data agenda in their strategy at all, right? Only few work in this direction. Majority no, probably because of the lack of regulatory direction, right? So or lack of understanding the value of this data exchange framework on national level, because sometimes they say we don't see the business case and it's not happening. So majority of them, they are not even collecting or processing the data or instructing the participant of national infrastructure to do it for them. There are, of course, some exceptions. We see that it start to change, as Douglas mentioned, so the PIX, the NPCI. I work very closely with the Central Bank of Philippines. I believe for more than last decades, they're leading national ISO 2022 schema that is applicable for high value payments as well as for retail payments. And they keep increasing the number of data points that need to be incorporated into the payment instructions. And I think it's going quite well. Of course, there are a lot of challenges. And as I mentioned, it's more than a decade already. But I see this movement, I see the improvement that leads to not only the fast, secure transaction processing, but as well as the capability of the receiving institution to perform some additional compliance check in automated mode because the data already there. And it's in line with the schema rules that are mandated by the central banks. And of course, it's in line with the National Data Privacy Act. So there are ways how to solve it. But the next level of the problem is not the central infrastructure, but last mile, right? So the many financial institutions, especially commercial banks, they rely on the legacy system. The data is fragmented. It's not structured. They don't have a capability to actually to follow the rules of those operators. They cannot enrich the data and exchange data with their counterparty. Even the infrastructure is in place. So I don't know how long it will take to solve this problem, the problem of last mile. Maybe years, maybe decades, but yeah, it's need to be addressed as well. So for national operators, what I see, while the technical solution might be there, the lack of the strategy in terms of data management and data exchange is just not in their agenda. They believe it's outside of their responsibility. Probably some regulatory guidance as well as some education and discussion with the industry participant might fix the situation. If we move to the cross-border space, like, so we're doing those regional payment system from 2013, I think, no, 2003, yeah. We have 5 of them already. We have single currency blocks. We have the multi-currency blocks where the multiple central banks building some central infrastructure for that. Single currency, it's more or less straightforward, right? So it's the single monetary policy, the regulation somehow aligned. And here, what we see, it's again lack of strategy and the last mile problem. So it's just there, and I believe the regulatory involvement in this mandatory approach is the most efficient one. If we talk about more complex case, when the multiple central banks are building some common infrastructure, then it's become much more complicated. So right now, what we're facing, full regulatory alignment, it's nearly impossible. So what we're doing at the end, we're building fences. So each jurisdiction will have sort of gateway that will maintain the data privacy. It will be responsible for the structuring of data when it's passing to the counterparty. And usually the amount of data that those gateway exchange, it's the minimum one. And we need to take care about the security of this data. So it's tokenization, make sure it's only counterparty will be able to see this data when they're receiving information, not the central node. So there are technical solutions for that, but yeah, regulatory alignment, of course, the availability of some sort of digital IDs that might be exchanged, probably the future, but right now it's not happening. So we're building fences and we're replicating those national approaches when we're connecting the jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Actually, you raised some great points, and it really resonates when you say that the sense of ownership or accountability even is missing. In terms of owning what is required to be done by either national infrastructures or even regulators at point. So I would come back to Douglas for a quick question, and maybe just a reflection on what you spoke about the approaches, and even Maxim mentioned that the mandatory approach seems to be working. Douglas, from your perspective, if you take maybe an example of how a mandatory approach has worked well in a market and established trust and trust anchors, perhaps versus something that's not. If you could just share a quick view of that, that'll be really helpful, I think, for this conversation.
Thanks, Rahul. Actually, I wanted to pick up a couple of things from Maxim's points. I think first, and this is actually coming from a project that Monica and I were just finishing up with the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, where essentially we're looking at the implementation of first generation DPI and sort of implications for second generation. And Maxim, one thing that we've seen is that quite a lot of jurisdictions which have been implementing, say, first generation DPI, the fast payment systems, the ID frameworks, that often they don't actually even have data laws. So in other words, if you don't have a data law, then it's not even something. And so now now that they have this framework, they're now thinking about how to build the data law. So it's actually a good time from the standpoint of thinking about some of these issues. But I wanted to, as Rahul was saying, I want to narrow in on some of these infrastructure systems that we're seeing. And as I said, I think in this second generation review, we've seen a number of jurisdictions which are basically thinking about how can we use first generation DPI systems to then enable that as a basis for a data system. And we're seeing this in some cases broadly. One can think about Singapore's MyInfo system as a mechanism which enables as an infrastructure to share data. One can think about some of the developments in Brazil or the UAE or India's sort of ongoing development of data aggregators. But we also see a number of more narrow examples. So if we think about, we've talked a lot about payments, and I think payments provide a good use case, but we're also seeing a couple of other areas where people are trying to do this. One is in the context of credit information. In other words, every jurisdiction has requirements on credit information sharing. There's often a credit information registry. How can one then build an infrastructure that makes this data better and more widely usable? And I think if one is thinking about a cross-border context, in addition to payments, the credit information is going to be one of those logical next steps, because one of the key lessons and I think Maxim highlighted this, is everyone's project is finding that the technology is workable. It's often the legal and governance issues that are providing the real headaches. And as I was framing in my first bit, those are very fragmented. And so it makes it a real challenge. And I think going forward, the other area of digital public infrastructure that is very much missing and that we need to sort out domestically and cross-border to make this work for the MSME problem is digital identity relating to companies and entities. And that's very much a second generation IDI challenge, but it's necessary to link the data.
Thanks, Douglas. And that is a massive challenge indeed, from various perspectives. And I think MSMEs and really benefit if that's taken on priority. I think we are almost at time. So a parting question to both of you. There's something which we have touched upon, but not really looked at during this last 20, 25 minutes of conversation. And it's deeply related to the regulatory fragmentation and inherent cultural almost and decision values. Um, Data localization, right? And we think about cross-border interoperability and fungibility of data, payments, and other aspects of finance. If we look at data localization as the challenge, what's your view for both of you on what could be one or two key actions that can be taken to overcome that challenge? Maybe Max first and then Douglas.
Yeah, for this one, I don't see much problem if the data will be stored locally. We definitely need some framework to be able to confirm validity of certain requests, like it should be identity, credit scoring, or something else, using the secure way of communication, considering the privacy and all those things. Again, technology is there. Just the way that the people need to agree what they can exchange and what safeguards need to be in place. And it takes decades. Even this infrastructure to process payments only, we don't talk about the data. Preparation itself takes 10, 15 years, right? Before the project starts. When you start the project, you start to face all those issues about the data privacy and you find technical solution that. But yeah, the agreement must be in place, and technology, we have multiple options to solve this task.
Douglas?
I'll just say exactly agree with Max, and I flagged a paper in the chat where essentially we discuss this idea, and I think the next panel is going to be discussing this as well. And I think this is a key point, and I would flag that in addition to essentially federated data structures, which is very much, I think, a trend that we're going to. The second is, I don't think data localization rules are going away, and that's something that we're just going to have to work around. The third point, and something to take away that I think is quite interesting, is we're seeing a number of regional approaches to try to build data centers. Some big announcements in the GCC along these lines last week, and we've seen a number of others. And I think this is a very interesting idea that we're seeing more and more jurisdictions look.
Fantastic. Thanks for those comments. And time obviously is required for trust and infrastructures to mature enough to the point where value comes automatically to MSMEs and other corporate and other segments. So thanks a lot for the comments. I really appreciate it. A great conversation. Back to you, Holly, to take the conversation forward.